Hi there, I'm Diane Callahan, developmental editor and YouTuber quotidian writer. I'm here again with Casey Norton, the author of The Tale of the Hidden Village, which is a high fantasy mystery as part of the Crimson Smoke and the Emerald Flame series. So this novel, with its beautiful, amazing, glossy cover, this is a book that tackles a lot of real-world issues when it comes to mental health and gender identity and bigotry, but it's using that high fantasy framework with it. So today we're kind of going to talk about that topic of looking at how fantasy can explore those real-world concerns in an impactful way. So with Crimson, so how would you describe the plot of the book, just to kind of give a background on it?
The spoiler-free version.
Yeah, spoiler-free, please.
Sherlock Holmes in Middle Earth. We have a Jotun character who is a kind of a big hulking Sherlock Holmes, and he creates essentially a John Watson character, someone who can go out and interact with people and people will feel really comfortable with and not make assumptions about, and is basically like kind of everything that he wants to be. And initially, when he creates this illusion, it's basically just a being made of light. He's completely controlling it. It's kind of a magical puppet. But at the very beginning of the book, that magical puppet, for various reasons, gains sentience and starts acting in ways, just kind of acting on their own based on the personality that he has imagined that this character would have. So they're kind of trying to navigate what does it mean to suddenly be a person with this reputation, and people sometimes recognize them, but this is the first moment of them being alive.
Yes.
And then trying to solve magical murders while also figure out what the heck they are, and convince the investigator that they are in fact real and not just at this point an extension of his subconscious.
Yes, it's so existential, especially for like a mystery novel. But I like that it's like the existential, but then also the entertainment of the murder mystery component all together. I love that so much.
Well, and they are able to communicate internally. So there's a fair bit of humor because they have very different personalities, even though one of them sort of created the other based on an inspiration.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this has a lot of analogs to like artificial intelligence and just how we defined existence and intelligence and things like that too. But what do you think are the other sort of real-world issues that the story tackles?
Talk a lot about mental health. There's also a lot of bigotry. The one character, he's visually very different from everybody else in this world, or at least the vast majority of people that they encounter at the beginning. So people make a lot of assumptions about him. They assume he's sort of animalistic. People assume that he's dumb, and he sort of plays into that because he gets a lot of anxiety around people. So he's kind of like grunting and whatnot. And so people, when they meet them, the idea is that they'll assume that Crimson, the main character, is the person that they're speaking to, and this is my dumb bodyguard or whatever. But he's really the brains of the operation. But so that dynamic changes a little bit. But we also start to see in a lot of what he's internalized about what other people have said to him, a lot of his kind of self-loathing and then having this character who kind of came out of his own mind, this person who came out of his own mind, trying to talk to him about his experience based on what they can feel from him. So there's a lot of stuff with mental health, some stuff with various forms of bigotry, and sorry.
And then Crimson is technically a non-binary character because Crimson goes also. I mean, or is it more like gender fluid? Because Crimson can be different genders as well, right? Or
well,
is
at this point,
sorry, am I spoiling something?
Well, it's something as the story progresses, they learn more and more about themselves because there's so much that they've been essentially a tool for him to be able, for Emerald to be able to use to do his job. And so Crimson is, as they start to figure out what about themselves they can control. So we have been saying generally they, although sometimes he or she, depending on, because they are male or female at this point in the series, and they can kind of decide between that.
Yeah.
So that's definitely,
yeah.
I wasn't thinking about that at the moment as of an issue, because it's not something that's ever really an issue for Crimson, other than trying to figure out how to keep people from figuring out that they're kind of a magical anomaly. But one of the things with that we were we really wanted to go into was having, there's also Emerald is gay, but it's not an issue. Like, he has a lot of other issues, but it's not something that's an issue for him. So we wanted to make sure that it was something that like that existed in this world, that was true for the characters, but that wasn't a problem for the characters to solve.
Exactly. And I think that's something that fantasy and sci-fi really allows for, is to have these different societal structures and expectations where certain things can be perceived as normal or non-issues and part of somebody's identity without having to be this huge source of conflict for them in their lives.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that I do write some, historical fiction or contemporary stuff. But one of the things that I really love about speculative fiction is that you can address, depending on what type of story you're telling, high fantasy or like far future sci-fi, that kind of thing. You can just take away any of the baggage that would be associated with certain things. And you're not erasing part of history. You're not minimizing people's experiences. You're going, okay, well, they're in this other world or in this other place or time, these things that are a really big issue here are non-issues or present in these totally different ways or have developed to a point where it's kind of unrecognizable for what's going on now.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that there are there are some like corollaries to the real world, like with Crimson is very attractive and wealthy looking as an illusion. Yes. And so there's sort of that lookism component of like, the bigotry that you talked about, where people making assumptions based on like how smart or how valuable you are as a person based on your appearance.
And all that preconception is really baked into the character. And as the character gets older, right, as they experience more of the world, they start to realize that they have a lot of, like, oh, why are those people dressed like that? Oh, I can look however I want, essentially for free. And other people don't have these same, but it's something that Crimson isn't thinking about it as like, oh, these peasants, why are these peasants dressed this way? That's just Crimson's experience of the world. It's like, you want to look nice, so you do look nice.
Yeah.
Right? And playing with some of those expectations of, privilege, but in a way that doesn't have an exact real world analog, so that we can explore that without, having a bunch of red flags.
Because it is like, it is like a learned experience, like any perceptions that we have. And I think that it's also, I think with Crimson, it's kind of a fish out of water story with that. Like, and I think that is charming. And it's like Crimson's still learning about the world and the expectations other people have of them. And
everything that Crimson knows at the beginning is taken from this other person's head who has experienced this other side of things and has internalized a lot of this narrative, right? It's like, well, I'm ugly and I'm worthless and whatever. And it's like, is that real? Because that's what the person who tells me everything about what I know, is parent kind of situation, but it's an adult essentially kind of going, well, wait a minute, like, you skip right to, well, can I trust what my parent in this case is telling me about them or about myself or about the relative value of people around me or how we interact with them.
Yeah, and I mean, like, Emerald's essentially, Crimson's creator. Like, it's kind of a Victor Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster kind of situation too. So, I find that really fascinating. I love that. So when it came to integrating these issues into the story, like, how did you approach, like, putting it into the story in a way that doesn't feel shoehorned?
So for things like Crimson's gender fluidity, there were, we brought up reasons why why would Emerald make a character, I keep saying character, why would Emerald make someone who can be, at this point, one or the other? And that there was kind of like there was a function for that in why why Crimson was made. So having it be something that was kind of baked in it wasn't like addressing a larger issue. It was just Crimson was going, oh, I was a guy with some kind of feminine qualities, and now I'm a girl with some kind of masculine qualities, and I'm just me. Like, that's and it was never an issue for Crimson, so we didn't have to address it as an issue. It's just that's just what was happening. For some of the stuff some of the mental health stuff is physically, Crimson is a physical embodiment of Emerald's issues, right? That they're part of Crimson's existence is trying to figure out where they came from in Emerald's psyche. So again, that was something that was just like the character was trying to figure something out rather than like make a sweeping statement about the world.
That makes sense.
And the bigotry thing was, I wanted to be able to include language that gets used against people, in terms of racism, in terms of ableism, and that kind of thing. So I was really careful with when we were talking about what people say to Emerald or what Emerald says about himself, to not have it be like a one-to-one correlation with any particular group or any particular religion or anything. That I was actively, for parts of it, I was choosing language that was around Colin Kaepernick. And then I would go and go like, oh, okay, well, in the 1920s in the Midwest, there was this like anti-Greek movement. So what kind of language were they using there to make sure that it was still all kind of relevant? It wasn't just like some, just trying to think of the worst thing I could, it was all things that other people have said historically, but making sure that it wasn't trying to code him as being like, oh, a non-human character who's like an analog for an African American character or something like that would be really problematic.
Yeah, that is something that's hard to do. But I think if it stems from like the world in some way and from the character, then that avoids it being like that's just showing some sort of parallel to the real world in a way that could be overgeneralizing or something like that.
I wanted him to feel othered, but I didn't want him to feel like a specific
that makes sense.
Target of othering.
Yes, that makes so much sense. What are things that people should also avoid in trying to tackle these real world issues? Because you spoke about like not having it be this direct one-to-one thing, but like what are some other potential problems in trying to incorporate real world issues?
Not having done your homework.
Yeah.
If you're writing about something that, for some of these things I'm writing, my version of like mental health stuff, like can we put this in here? Because this is really relevant to me, right? Or especially some things that happen later in the series. It's like, is this too dark or can we go there? And then for some of the other things, like how Emerald's perceived in the world and how, his self-internalized, there are a lot of stories that, fantasy stories, I think in particular, that are written to try to be inclusive, but end up feeding into these stereotypes and othering in ways that are actually like counterproductive to whatever you're trying to say, that can actually just reinforce kind of harmful stereotypes. Like I mentioned, if you're going to go through, and I say races like D&D races, right? Like, if you have goblins, you have dwarves, you have elves, but if you have those as analogs for different racial groups, then it's like, well, then there are the white humans, and then, all these other, almost other species. Like that's something that I've seen in some things that's an issue.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that making any culture like a monolith that's like a really big issue. And I think like, not in having like this, oh, this race is like this and this one's like that, instead of having like a wide spectrum of experiences and personalities and things like that.
Yeah, well, and for other things like sexuality or gender identity, right? In fantasy and sci-fi, like again, you don't have to have that existing baggage. So when I see people using sci-fi and fantasy to address as though it's like it almost implies that it's unavoidable, that like homophobia, for example, is unavoidable because in this totally different world with totally different politics, it still looks exactly the same as it does like contemporary, which I think, there are some cases where I think it can be done really well if it's mindful, but I think when it's approached kind of in a slapdash or ham-fisted way, it can feel like saying like, well, there's no escaping this. Like no matter what you do, this is going to be the baseline, which is an issue.
So we talked about this a bit earlier, but what do you think is the added benefit of talking about real-world issues in fantasy as opposed to contemporary fiction?
Yeah, I think anytime with speculative fiction, you can create the world in enough of a different way that something is different without, if you're doing like history or contemporary fiction and you want to address certain topics, but you don't want to like get, like, oh, I don't want to address the darker aspects of them. If you take them out of the story, it can basically erase people's experience or kind of revise like revisionist history kind of situation, which can be, with science fiction and fantasy, when you alter the world in a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking somebody else's experience out of it, as long as you're mindful about how you're approaching it. I feel like that made no sense whatsoever.
No, it
anyway.
does, because I think that there's something to it. It's like, oh yeah, we don't want everything to be super homophobic, but because then that's kind of erasing the real world. Although sometimes we do want escapist stories that do that,
Sure.
but then other ones that might be like exploring this kind of darker dystopian kind of experience of that. So I think that there is value in that, but then also recognizing that in the real world too, there's a lot of like bright spots and like really dark spots in terms of like how social issues are progressing or changing. So it's like it's not all gloom and doom, and it's not all hope either. So
and I think when you do certain types of speculative fiction, you can have kind of a utopian scenario, for example, and not go, okay, but we're only focusing on like a little bit of the population, for example. Or ignoring, there are certain types of stories that I know I'm never going to write that are historical or contemporary, because I just I can't, because there are going to be nuances that I don't get. There's going to be I would unintentionally generalize about people's experiences without I wouldn't know, no matter how much research I do. There's going to be stuff that I like, small stuff that I don't know. And with science fiction and fantasy, I'm creating the world, right? It doesn't, I'm not erasing somebody else's experience or speaking over somebody.
True.
And one of the things that I've seen a lot of people talking about recently is with sci-fi and fantasy, why are you including characters that are not straight, white, cisgender? You can. Some people use it as just like, oh, we'll just include like one to acknowledge that this world exists, or to show something about the world, like. I think this is old enough that I can say this, like Aragon. There's like one black character in it, and everyone's like, whoa, that person's really weird, and like, did they dye their skin? Like, what, and like there's still this othering element that's like, what are you doing? and so there are more with sci-fi and fantasy. There's a lot more stuff coming out now where there's casual diversity. It's just like, okay, well, these people just exist in the world, and it's not like we need one person to show that something is different about this location. It's just like, that's just, why not? Why not have black mermaids? Why not have,
Yeah, because I think that's the thing, is that I think people we're so unaccustomed to diversity to the extent that they're like, wow, that stands out way too much. But then now that it's becoming more like common and realistic, in the sense that it's actually representing, populations and different perspectives, that I think that now it's becoming more like, oh yeah, like you can just have that character exist and not have it be a big deal, because it really doesn't have to be. Like, it doesn't have to be this big, like, tokenism kind of thing where you're putting in a character just to check a box. Like, I think that can be very overwhelming for writers, because they kind of feel like, oh my gosh, I don't want to offend somebody, and I don't want to, but then I'll offend people if I don't do this, and then also if I do this. But I think that the way to approach that is just to have a really like wide variety. Like, you don't have to have this one character that represents this one idea. Just like, okay, I'll have like a few characters like this, a few characters like that, and then just having like a lot of different experiences represented, and not having to feel like it's this, story breaking thing. Like, you don't have to address those issues in your world if that's not your experience either. Like, I think that's another thing with tackling real world issues, is that it's best to speak to ones that are very personal to you. Like, for you, talking about like the mental health angle of it, it's obviously very personal. So I think that stories are always stronger when we speak from personal experience, and not feeling like you're speaking on somebody else's behalf with it. But
I was going to say, having characters that are just like plot points, right? Like, oh, here's like diversity, whatever. And again, I keep saying diversity is the like pretty much, there are so many different like lateral intersectional things that you could be talking about. So like, to say that, like, if you're like, my story is not diverse, it's like, well, then who's in your story?
Yeah.
But yeah, when you introducing characters that maybe for something that's not immediately relevant to you, not having their existence be like a plot point, or like they only exist to like further the journey or something of a main character that is more, maybe that you identify with more, for example, to actually,
Yes, it makes sense. And that's also like the importance of having different readers read your story, and like reading a lot of other books that are from that perspective, so that you feel like you are doing your research, as they say. So I think that's really important. And I was also wondering, so what are some other fantasy novels that you've enjoyed that have tackled these kind of big themes? You have your list.
Yeah, I actually just finished reading the Montague siblings series. So I think it's the Nobleman's Guide to Shipwrecks and Scandal.
Oh
or
yeah,
something
so
is
I
the
mean,
last
well, there's
one.
the Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue,
Virtue,
and
yeah.
then the Lady's Guide to Petticoats
Coats
and Piracy.
yeah.
I've read both of those.
Okay,
Yes.
well, I just read the third one, and if you haven't read it, you should.
Damn it, I haven't read it yet. Damn it.
Okay, well, there's that she's someone who each of those books she's talking about some aspect of her personality or her life experience that she didn't see reflected in fantasy adventure novels growing up. So there's a character in the last one who has some mental health stuff that I was like crying on the treadmill in the gym while I was reading it. So yeah, I recommend that one.
Okay, no,
that one's a little bit there are certain parts of that are a little like kind of a heavy hitter, but let's see. Boxers and Saints actually is a graphic novel, but it's a 2-part graphic novel, and it's set during the Boxer Rebellion in China. But it's two people on sort of different sides of the religious conflict.
Interesting.
Each of them having their religion is real because they are literally interacting with the deities that they are fighting for. So they're going like, yeah, I had this Joan of Arc experience. Oh, I actually get my power from like the Chinese gods that I'm representing, right? So it's sort of allegorical, but presents it as though it's really happening in real time. So that's something that was a scenario that I didn't know that much about. So like reading that was going, okay, that's a way to really get in those characters' heads and really, you feel for the one person, whoever you read first, you're like, yeah, they're not wrong, and then you go to the other one, you're like, oh, okay, so they're not really wrong either, right? So the way that he portrays both of those was really interesting to me. And I'm just finishing How Long Till Black Future Month, which is N.K. Jemisin's short story collection, which is it's pretty. You see the short story that The City We Became came out of, and sometimes there are short stories where she's responding to other authors. So she responds to Ursula Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, I think, is the original one. So she responds to that in a way that she was going, I didn't really see myself reflected in, when she's talking about queer identity, when she's talking about African American identity, when she's talking about some of the like city, like inner city situations. She's like, I just didn't see myself in fiction for a long time, and so I put myself in it. And so that's been something that I really she comes at a bunch of different angles. So sometimes it's just like kind of one focus for each story, and so that's something that I've really enjoyed, because I feel like some of them are very light and fun, and some of them are, you have to sit and think with them for a little bit.
Yes, that's excellent. And I was actually thinking of Omelas when we were talking about the utopian world, and then there's having that balance of light and dark, where there's like, here's this utopian world, but also very dark trade-off, and that idea, and then that N.K. Jemisin is responding to that to present a different way of modeling society, and like I think that's also something really powerful with speculative fiction and these real world issues, is that we can kind of take that what if question and really question, really interrogate, I guess, the real world structures that we have.
Well, and it's been interesting as I watch more people's feedback on certain stories. There's one that's just very, the second book just came out, and it's like a robot in this kind of utopian, it's like cozy sci-fi, like utopian robot scenario, and a bunch of people were going like, oh, it's a great representation of like non-binary asexuality, that kind of thing. And then I was seeing, somebody else was going, okay, but like the utopia that's described here is pretty anti-Semitic, and like, not that it's necessarily something intentional on the part of the author, but even just seeing like there are things that I wouldn't think to question. So what, having that conversation from different people about what things mean, or what they imply, or how what a perfect world looks like, for example. I think that's a valuable conversation. Again, I think that particular book, Psalm for the Wild Build.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were talking about. Becky Chambers, right? Yeah.
So that was something, it was like, I'm sure that was something that she was not intending. I'm not trying to imply that, but to then have that, it's a similar thing with the N.K. Jemisin story, is like, yeah, okay, so there are people who walk away from this utopia. What about the people who stay and kind of put themselves on the line for the things that they care about and want to fight for? So I think that, even within the genre, you can have this kind of dialogue about like, well, what about this? What if this? Well, okay, but let's come at it from a different angle. So even kind of the retelling these stories is yeah, there's a lot. I think there's a lot to be gained from it. And with sci-fi and fantasy, you can have that conversation in a way that isn't, you're taking a step back from it.
Mm-hmm.
It can be kind of light. It can be fun, right? It doesn't have to feel like work necessarily as someone who's consuming that media, but it can be kind of allow you to think about things in different ways and then have discussions about things like in the context of this book. What are we saying here? What are we learning about this? How could we think in the future to not make these assumptions or not have these blind spots? So,
but I think it's also important to think about how it's really hard to write a book that isn't controversial in the sense when you're writing about real world issues, because people are always going to have differing opinions, like with the Becky Chambers book. And I was thinking of Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which is about situational depression.
Yeah.
And, and there were some reviews that were kind of critical of how he represented depression, but, these are based on his own experiences.
Yeah, actually, with that one, I was, so one of my friends is part of a book club, and they, the book club read that Midnight Library, and one of the people in the book club was like, I have clinical depression, and this is a wildly inaccurate depiction of it. I bet this man has never met anyone depressed in his life. And then they looked up the person's bio, and it's like, has all this background in talking about clinical depression and all this other experience and writing from their own. So yeah, I mean, you're just talking about a monolith earlier. Like, I don't think there's, you're never going to be, it wouldn't even make sense to try to tell a story that's like all encompassing.
Yeah.
But I think being able to have that dialogue and setting it in a speculative fiction world takes away a little bit of the urgency, because you don't necessarily have to defend, like, here's my experience, here's myself. Like, I'm sure there are people who are going to read this Crimson and Emerald and go like, well, that's not what my depression looks like. So, okay, well, all right.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that just to take the pressure off of anybody that's trying to write something that incorporates like their own personal experience, especially, but also like their own observations about like real world issues, just know that it is like this conversation, and that people having different ideas about something and discussing things, I think that's actually really valuable. So
personally, I feel like I would rather get something wrong and have a conversation about it, or realize that there was something that I didn't notice, or like, oh, that's so far out of my experience that I wasn't even on my radar. I would rather do that than just go, well, I'm just not going to address anything that doesn't feel safe. And I think speculative fiction is a place it can feel safer, even if you're stepping outside your comfort zone a little bit.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, it's the same for any author. It's going to be a risk no matter what you write. And I think that it's better to take those risks and to really be true to your own experience, be mindful of other people, but then also like, if you go into a story and you do the best that you can, like that is really like, that's, you can always learn from those experiences too, but, don't put this expectation on yourself of perfection or getting everything right, because I don't think there's such thing.
Well, and I think one of the things that's really cool with indie publication is, I read a lot, and I was reading up until quite recently, like books that were coming out of traditional publishing, and there's gatekeeping there. Even if you go, oh, well, it's not malicious there, but it's what already sells. Yep. Right. It's trying to recreate something that was already successful, and so there were a lot of people whose stories, books or life stories were not didn't fit into that kind of like neat, broad category. And so one of the things that's cool with indie is that people are able to go like, okay, well, here is my story, and even if only 600 other people in the world are interested in interacting with this fantasy world or whatever, that you can find those people.
Dang it, she was saying everything perfect. I'm sorry. When did it go out?
The last 3 words.
Okay. Well, I said some stuff. I hope it was good enough.
No, it's not. It's good. How is it? Can you hear? How's it now? Okay, great. So, but yeah, segueing off of that idea of indie publishing, though, is that if you do want to support indie authors exploring these different ideas, so we have The Tale of the Hidden Village by Casey Norton and Riley Rookhouse. So, this is just a wonderful novel, and if you like high fantasy, you like mystery, you like a bit of existentialism in your fantasy, then like absolutely get a print copy, ebook copy.
Yeah,
Yes, we'd appreciate that.
There's a more to come in that I'm just really excited about.
Yes,
so.
it is a series. So it's a standalone mystery, but it is a series that has a through line to it. So thank you all for joining us today in our story garden.